Okay, so when faced with this somewhat daunting task of trying to start a motor that doesn't belong into this car, notes that faded away, questionable wiring, and forgetting where you had left off, what do? You go back to the basics. As someone that's trying to diagnose a starting problem on a vehicle, the very first thing you do is turn the key. Simple enough, right? Now, based on what happens when you turn the key will pinpoint you in a direction. Basically, I'm treating it like a flowchart almost. You turn the key, does the starter kick in or does it not? If it doesn't, check your f***ing battery. In my case, it did. Because of that, my direction is now turned towards the engine. What makes the engine turn on? What does it need to start the combustion process? For me, I've broken it down to 4 categories: timing, fuel, air, and spark. And a little caveat under the category of air: compression. These are, to me, the 4 main ingredients you need to make the motor go boom, 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 and if any of these things were missing, then it won't go boom. I guess you can have shitty timing and still kind of run, but whatever. You get what I'm saying. For fuel, I know the system isn't hooked up, as in the feed and return lines aren't hooked up, and neither is a fuel pump. I'll be using brake clean as a substitute for fuel, kind of like ether or starter fluid. So fuel should be good. Timing? Well, I'm trusting the previous owner with that one. He's a good friend of mine. It's unlikely he took apart the motor before he sold it to me. If I really did have to check for timing, it's not that hard. It's pretty easy. Air. Technically, even if the throttle body, supercharger, and intake manifold weren't plumbed up to the rest of the engine, it should technically start. But then again, I'm not 100% sure on the starting parameters for this engine, so to rule that out, I'm just going to go ahead and connect all those components. To make matters worse, I found several vacuum ports not plugged, and those that were plugged were just worn out and cracked. So just as bad as not being plugged. So let's go ahead and plug those guys up. Now for the intake. I have a whole bunch of piping and silicone couplings to piece me together something temporary to bridge the supercharger and the intake manifold. Keyword guys, temporary. This is how the air travels on a 4A GZE. Air gets pulled into the throttle body here. You don't see it, but there's piping going down from the throttle body and going in between the engine block and supercharger. It's really tight and most people don't ever see it. From there, the supercharger does its thing and compresses the air and spits it back out into what should be an intercooler. But I haven't installed that yet, so just pretend there is one. And then finally into the intake manifold. Cool, right? Still not starting. What was the last item that I needed? Right, spark. How most people test for spark, it's fairly simple, at least with these old motors. Pull out the spark plug wire, shove a screwdriver into it, and with the exposed part of the screwdriver, find a spot that can ground and lay it upon it. For me, I chose the strut tower bolts because they're pretty close and some of the spark plug wires are fairly short. Then you crank the starter and see if you get an arc from the screwdriver to the ground. Wow, 3 out of 4 so far hasn't arced. Not even going to test the fourth one. I'm going to go ahead and say, yeah, none of it works. There you go. I found my problem, and a big problem at that. I have absolutely no spark. So now I got to trace the ignition system from the spark plug wires all the way up to wherever it starts. It would really help if my damn notes didn't fade in the sun. Thankfully, there's always the internet. And from what I read, there isn't really much of the system. And I've come to the conclusion that none of it was working. There wasn't any power going to any of these locations. So now I'm thinking there are numerous factors that could be screwing me over right now. Could just be a bad ground, some loose wiring, a short in the electronics, components going bad from sitting for so long. But my gut instincts are telling me it was my rushed wiring on the 22-pin side of the ECU. Because really, that's the only thing I had my hand in. Everything else was kind of plug and play. So I got a bit curious and decided to open up the ECU, and thank God I did, because I found this. That blown capacitor right there? I have no goddamn clue what it does. I don't know if it still works. I don't know if it's been like that this whole time, but something tells me it's affecting the ignition system. Maybe because the burn marks go all the way up to the pins that coincidentally go to the ignition components? I don't know. At this point, I'm weighing in my options. I could either A, find another 89661 12611 late model JDM 8092 for a GZE ECU. Wow, no. Or B, use the 89661 12790 JDM for a GZE AE101 ECU. If you can remember back many moons ago in episode 14, the only real difference between the two ECUs are a few pins. Well, which pins are they? Well, let's compare. Not bad, only 5 pins are different. 4 pins were easily movable on the 22-pin port side since it didn't have a main plug. The 5th pin, on the other hand, was oddly placed from the 22-pin port to the 16-pin port that proved to be a pain in the ass to reposition. Once again, moment of truth.